This is my book review of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So I definitely like this book quite a bit. It's a fiction book, and if you kind of have picked up on the theme of fiction books I typically read, is these books push the extreme for sure, and I think they kind of try to reveal to us a little bit something deeper about like human nature and where our civilization is going and how certain extreme ideas have to be very thought about very carefully and potentially avoided. So this whole thing is like in a futuristic world where they use a form of kind of IVF like scientific process to mass produce sets of hundreds of identical twins for work. And so they keep most of these twins that are like produced sterile, but there are some females who retain fertility as like a margin of error, and they give male sex hormones to normal females to create things called free martins, which are like fully sterile like females. And then they also predestinate and optimize each produced person for the work they'll be assigned to. They actually starve certain embryos of oxygen in order to produce mindless workers who can't think but only work. And another goal of the process of like their kind of creation process, which is completely mechanical and factory like, is to create a deep love within each individual for the work that the individual would be predestinated for to keep them happy so they won't ever feel discontent or revolt. So overall, this book, like, I think it's really beautiful in how it ties in a lot of ideas, and there's like a futile struggle, and I think it's like kind of similar to stuff like American Psycho and The Stranger, like books which I've both reviewed on my channel already, because they both take something that's kind of modern in a sense, right? It's like, oh, it's in a sense you can see the people behaving the same way, so it's kind of feels closer to us, it feels like we could be in this scene. But then it takes things out of context and it shows what can happen, and what is certain like dangerous ideologies and things like that we get into. But yeah, I really liked how there's like a lot of different themes being tied in here. So I'm going to go through my notes and it'll kind of go through the majority of the main points of the book. And there's a lot of interesting separations and just points of emphasis that he has that I really like. Okay, so they use electric shocks and loud noises, and then they can condition the lower caste. So they have a caste system, just like kind of one example today is like Indian society. In India, there's like a caste system. I'm not too familiar with it, but I just know that like there's very strict kind of rules of who can interact with each other, right? So using electric shocks and loud noises, they condition the lower caste babies to be deathly afraid of books so that they never read, and scared of flowers such that they never aim to express love or waste time finding flowers to express it. Because they're all about optimizing mega efficiency, like all of that. That's like the kind of idea of this new civilization, right? And this is supposed to take place on Earth as well. And they use a speaker played while the new humans are sleeping early on to ingrain their caste system beliefs into them subconsciously. So they have this like paragraph that's like been mechanically recorded and it's just playing on their beds pretty much 24/7 as they're sleeping, and they're just getting like subconsciously just osmosis into their brain, Okay, and then so some parts of this gets like really weird. So there's like children, right? And as children, they're encouraged to explore like pleasure and sexuality and that kind of stuff. And so the idea from the state perspective is that if they can eliminate all jealousy by teaching people early on that there's nothing special about sex, then they can better control people, since they won't be emotional and will be more willing to procreate with anyone in times of need. Yeah, it's really like, if you think about society, right, like sex is supposed to be a very like relatively like special thing, at least, right? Like I think most people could agree with that. It shouldn't be something that's just like, the same as like shaking somebody's hand. I mean, I hope not. But so the point is, from the state's perspective, though, like from population level, you don't want to actually have this kind of, specificity, because like that means you have all these situations where you could potentially have conflict, right? What if somebody likes someone else, but somebody else marries them, right? Or somebody else has kids with them, and that's like a off limits thing. Like that's a complicated situation that could result in somebody getting very upset. And you don't want people to get upset, because if somebody gets upset, then they start feeling emotions, and then they can cause a revolt, and they can, upend the civilization. So that's kind of the idea about it. Of course, they're taking it to extreme, right? But yeah. Okay, the next part is they've created the perfect drug, which makes everyone happy but not addicted and no hangover. And this it's called soma, and this prevents people from experiencing too much emotion or sadness, which might be bad, and makes them all happy. So like, if all this social conditioning doesn't work, they just take some of that soma stuff, and then they feel a lot better. Okay, and so then we have this interesting pairing of two guys. So we have one who's inferior at the bottom of upper caste society. So even though he was born into upper caste society, he's inferior because he's shorter than normal. And his name's Bernard Marx. And another who is the king of upper caste society and a true specimen in that, like, he gets all the ladies, he's, just kind of adored, all this stuff, right? And they come together because they're both slightly distressed about and have a feeling of need for something deeper than what is offered them in this world of endless pleasure, right? So the second guy is a little too smart, so he thinks about stuff a little too much. And I think it's very interesting, the pairing of the top and the bottom of the standard distribution. We typically argue that, like, what can happen is if you imagine the population of, like, IQ kind of as a standard distribution curve, the people at the bottom and the people at top in some cases think very similar, because it's like when you do a little bit of thinking but you don't go all the way, then you reach a kind of like half opinion. And I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just saying you reach a different opinion. And sometimes when you don't think at all and when you think about it for a super long amount of time, you actually reach the same conclusion. And so that's a funny thing that I think he's pointing out here, with pairing these two people together, in the sense that they kind of don't fully, rebuke the world, but they have a little bit of discontent where everybody else is just happy and normal. And I think it's funny because, like, I think halfway through the beginning of the book, I was like, oh, these people are the main characters. And, like, they kind of are, but the main character doesn't really, reveal itself until, like, halfway through the book. And then these people just become, like, side characters. So that was an interesting twist, I think, because it would have been cool to see their development, but maybe it was the fact that they weren't even supposed to develop. And we'll see that later on, that they're not as strong as we imagine them to be. Okay, so time is marked in AF. So this is obviously a play on AD, just like, Christ was born and after death, and that was like the defining moment of how they counted time. So AF stands for after Ford, and Ford is literally referencing Henry Ford, who created the Model T. So this book was produced I think 1930s something. So I don't know exactly when the Model T came out, but I think it's sometime around there. And they even they say Ford's name and Ford's sake, and they say Ford just instead of God. So the idea is that this hyper capitalistic society, right? Or you can even say, right, it's paralleling to today, how people can worship tech oligarchy, and how capitalism can become a kind of God in itself when we idolize the rich, right? When we all think that, they're everything. And so just how back in that time, maybe Henry Ford was everything. Everybody's like, wow, he's created the first automobile. And I think this is a really interesting concept to think about, because we're back in the 1930s, everybody's dying of all these diseases, right? It's super uncultured. There's nothing going on, and they can't relate to us at all. But actually, even though, okay, maybe there's AI today, right? But it's a different technology, but the same impact and effect, right? You kind of be like, whoa, these people, Sam Altman, they created AI, and it's super awe-inspiring, and everybody's like, wow. And so it's kind of the same emotions that people would have felt with the first automobile of the Model T. They're just wow. And there can be just so much kind of wow, look at us. We're a progressing society. We're doing so well. We're so, refined. We're making so much, amazing progress. We're going to reach this utopia state. Elon Musk talks about utopia all the time. Right. So I hope now, maybe in the 1930s, although in the 1930s, you still shouldn't have an excuse, because you could still look at history and realize it's never going to be the case, right? We're never going to reach it utopia state, just because humans are so fallible. We have so many issues that you're not going to be able to fix all the issues. So you're always going to have somebody that's jealous. I mean, this is a fake situation where you fix all those issues so nobody is jealous and everybody's happy. But in reality, right, you're never going to reach that. So it's good to just be aware of that. And that's why you have to learn about other past events, about how people act, right? Okay, let's keep going on here. Yeah, so short guy Bernard is actually sent to a form of therapy where they drug everyone and with a soma, and they do a ritual to make them all feel in oneness, but he doesn't actually feel anything. He's too self-aware of everything and doesn't lose himself in the moment. He just fakes it. It's very interesting because Bernard struggles to get girls, but then in the session he's allowed to have any girl he wants because it is therapy, which makes no sense. And then afterwards, he lies to one of the girls and says that like he enjoyed it, And it reveals that Bernard has a hole in him that makes him different from others and also cannot be filled with the shallow pleasure of worldly things. When I wrote that was before I read what happened like later on. So I was so shocked because like Huxley took this idea of Bernard, which was in the beginning, is like, oh, he's going to be our savior. He's going to be the person who's like taking out, standing up for what's right, standing up for humanity against this like extremely sterile copy paste society. And then we see Bernard just like completely fails. Like I'll get to it later, but like it's just crazy how utterly he fails. Like he just does not have a spine at all. Okay, and then this was just a random thought I had while reading, but like, why does the main characters who question their existence in the beginning or who have these deeper questions, why do they have to be males, right? Why don't we see that questioning in the females earlier? I mean, I know this is a book in 1930s, but I'm like, it would be good to see some balance there, because then like what pretty much happens is there's this girl that Bernard really likes called Lenina, and throughout the book, she's just like clueless. Like she does get a little bit of awakening, but it's always like this idea that I don't know like why. Like it's just painted as like, oh, men have this like deeper yearning question. I'm like, okay, both people could have that deeper yearning question. It doesn't need to be just like always males, Anyway, so yeah, Lena Nina, Bernard really likes her. She's completely lost in the sense that she's just like drinking the Kool-Aid, believes everything's great, thinks it's fine to just sleep with anybody, and like so does everybody else in society. That's just how it is. And then like so yeah, Bernard wants to date. Like so here's what they do. They kind of date around, and by dating around I mean they like kind of sleep around and do activities together and have fun, I guess. And then so anyway, he wants this date like because usually they always have to do stuff. And like as in like they go to like a movie theater. They go like always doing something, right? There's never like an idle moment. That's like a key theme of the book. But she gets like completely, she just like looks at him blankly when he's like, can we just like walk and talk? Like, can we not do, she wants to go play this thing called obstacle golf. And then she proposes, oh, let's go do something else. So she's very confused because she's like, don't we like do something? And she can't fathom or imagine what they could possibly be talking about, right? Because there's no depth to anything. Well, so she said, if they aren't going to go out to do some sort of activity, then what is time for? Instead, she forces Bernard to go with her to a sporting match, and Bernard complains about always being in a crowd. So this is something I was thinking about, like, oh, maybe in the crowd you can't think because you lose your mind to groupthink or emotions. And then, for some reason, they put the soma, like, it's like an antidepressant. They put it in everything. So he refuses the antidepressant drugged ice cream that she offers him. And again, it's not drugged just because she put it in there. It's like everybody has had that drug version of ice cream, which, like, everyone's eating and saying he would rather be himself. So he says he'd rather be himself and gloomy or nasty than someone else and happy. And then later on, he parks their helicopter and he just wants to look at the dark, stormy ocean in peace with her. But she can't take it because she thinks it's so horrible. So she tries to distract herself by turning on the radio to full blast, but he turns it off and she starts crying. Bernard then says how the ocean makes him feel more himself and how he doesn't want to be an epsilon, which is their social caste level, which is the highest one or one of the higher ones, And so Lenina shudders in horror at this blasphemy against the collective, and Bernard flips out on her pretty much. So you want to keep this in your mind because you're like, okay, Bernard is this character who's like super amazing, like standing up for what's right, blah, 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 blah. And then because he's like, I guess, acting bad, his superior at his work is like kind of saying, you're going to be sent to Iceland. And he freaks out because he's faced with a challenge of something that he's unsure about how to handle on his own, because everything in their life is so like conditioned. It's all like perfect. It's engineered. Yeah. And then another aspect of this world is that people are kept looking extremely young through a series of medical processes, and then at 60, they suddenly die to prevent any showing of old age. So they've also never seen old age, right? So Bernard's idea of a date is to go visit the savages on the reservation with Lenina, okay? And these represent like unpurified people living quote unquote normal lives, right? So there's an escapee so on the reservation. It's supposed to represent Native Americans, I guess. Then there's an escapee from civilization who has been converted and remains as a savage now. So there's this person who came on a date or something and then was left there, and yeah. So the interesting thing is you see this conflict with, like, she had her promiscuous ideas that were imbued in her from the civilization with the idea like everyone can have everyone, right? And then she's beaten by the other woman for breaking the norm in the reservation, because in the reservation, it's more like, you could say more like normal society, where you're kind of like, okay, one person kind of thing, and like chill out, And yes, they're saying that the men who were sleeping with Lenina were their men, right? So I was kind of viewing this from like an evolutionary survival lens, because you think if you've taken biology and like evolutionary fitness, you can kind of view it in this lens. And I think it's definitely interesting because this happens a lot with like animals and like their actions and thinking about like how to maximize offspring fitness and, gene viability, all that stuff, right? So the women have to punish Lena, the escapee, because if their men have children with Lena, then that would likely reduce the care or effort their men put into the children that have already been birthed, because it would split the man's responsibilities between two sets of children, thus likely reducing the evolutionary fitness and viability of the next generation of offspring, which would have a 50% of the woman's genes in it. So in a sense, the women have a personal stake in ensuring Linda doesn't sleep with other men. Of course, like, we don't see them like necessarily have kids or anything, but this is like I would say it's a more realistic explanation. I don't know if Huxley really intended that. Although the interesting thing was his grandfather was like was called Charles Darwin's bulldog, and like there was a lot of science in the family too. So even though he wasn't a scientist, like he uses like quite a few very advanced like terms in here, and he's definitely like well understood in the terms of like he knows the words a lot. Okay, so Linda, so that's John's mom. So John is kind of the son that was birthed, like actually physically birthed. So everybody's made in a bottle, really, in the civilization. Here, people are actually given birth normally. And his dad is somebody in civilization who, like, said he lost his wife, right? Or not his wife. He lost the girl he was on a date with, which was Linda. And then he just went back to civilization. But Linda was still there. And then so they're like now mother and son here, right? So Linda, John's mom, worked at the embryo factory, and so but then like you start to see that this like uselessness of her highly specialized knowledge is revealed in the tribal setting, since she can't do anything practical like mend clothes for her child. And I think this represents how fragile the highly segmented knowledge we have today that we so anxiously pursue is, and how divorced from reality is, right? I can type on a keyboard, and I can click buttons, and I can I can engage in financial speculation, and I can make money that way, right? But if you have no idea how to cook food for yourself, or how to even, let's say, grow any food, if you take away society from me and put me out there on my own, I will just die, right? So it's very interesting how divorced from reality a lot of our skills are. Okay, so then Linda eventually returns to her long lost lover who birthed their child John. She gets ridiculed and he is ashamed of her. Linda then proceeds. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that happens between this point, but pretty much what happens is John grows up, he's beaten, he's ostracized by the community because his mom is kind of a person who sleeps around a lot, right? And that's not looked good, and he feels terrible about that. And then he's taught to read by his mom, which I guess is one benefit. And then he's given Shakespeare, so he reads Shakespeare. Shakespeare is banned. All forms of normal literary texts are banned in the civilization. On the reservation, nobody cares, right? And the reservation is also painted as this horrendous place where people have all these diseases. You have people with goiters. You have people with all this flies, fleas. All this stuff is disgusting, right? And try to emphasize how oh my gosh, these people, they're so uncivilized. They're unclean. This is terrible. But then they have something else that's really important, but I'll get to that later. So anyway, Bernard decides to bring back Linda and John and, bring them back and have this reunion event. So she finds the guy who's the father of the son, right? And she actually calls him dad. John actually calls him father, and then Linda says she's the mother. The crazy thing is in society, because there's no more normal procreation, so in the civilization, when you say father and mother is a derogatory term, or it's just such a loaded term that nobody says it, because it's how can earth have a mother, right? Nobody has a mother anymore. And then father is more like a joke term that's so for example, when John comes in, right? And he's like, "Oh, Dad, you're my father." Everybody starts laughing in the factory because they're all looking at him. They're like, "There's no way you could have a father, right? That's not how it works." They've been taught a certain way from the very beginning no, that's not how it works. So what happens is Linda then proceeds to lay in bed and take endless amounts of soma drug, right, until she dies, which won't be until a few years later, to try and forget and block the memory. So pretty much she gets rejected, right, by the one person she loved, because this society doesn't allow people to love each other, because when you love, you create emotion, and emotion creates dangerous thoughts and feelings, and that's bad. So they would rather have a situation where everybody has everybody and there's no exclusivity. Okay, now this gets really interesting. This is what I'm talking about Bernard, okay? He finally gets all the girls he wants because he brings in John as a specimen to be studied as the first child they known who's actually brought into this world through the old-fashioned birthing approach. This makes him a hero in civilization. Bernard a hero, okay? Bernard becomes really full of himself, overly confident, but the others don't like to see him like he is. Bernard pretty much uses John as a tool to get what he wants and then writes long academic papers about John's reaction and his behavior when he's exposed to different aspects of civilization. It's kind of frustrating as a reader because we expect Bernard to be the one to rally against the system, but then we realize that he's only against the system because he's suffering from it. He doesn't really have any intellectual commitment to his ideas and instead drops them immediately once he gains success. He no longer tries to remove himself from society and find a better way, but instead accepts the way it is since he benefits from it. In a sense, we are betrayed by him and he sells out for his passions and pleasures of women. He pretty much does a 180 flip, and now he no longer criticizes anybody because he benefits from it. And he feels, and it's just like, man, we were like let down, right? We're like, oh, this guy's supposed to stand up for what's right. He's going to change the system. And I think this highlights, because we'll see how the book ends, it's just that like, when society becomes such a strong force pushing you in one direction with such rewards in that direction, right? To go against it for a long period of time and not have a reason to, like, let's say, okay, for Bernard, he was the runt of the litter, right? So he had a reason because he didn't get the stuff he wanted. So he could kind of rationalize by saying, oh, there's something wrong with the system, right? But it's like when you're at the top and you enjoy all the benefits of the system, you're not going to ridicule it because you're enjoying the benefits, right? And so that just shows how these people don't have any, you know, they don't really care about their actual ideas. They're willing to just, you know, switch them out. Just like how, you know, many of the men and women in the society are so promiscuous with each other and open with everything. Just like with their ideas, it seems like they don't have any, you know, personalization of it. They don't take any, like, ownership of their ideas. And they just let them freely to come and go. Be like, oh, I believe this now, I will change it later. And that's what happens to Bernard. He completely switches up. Okay. The Shakespeare book that John learned to read with was falling apart and the cover got eaten by mice. So this highlights how it contains such inner worth and value that only someone who sees the value will recognize its worth. Even though the reservation is extremely dirty and uncivilized, it contains hidden value and that there is a deep, rich culture and purpose and meaning to existence, which is a hidden true value within that is unable to be seen from the exterior. However, in civilization, the exterior looks so wonderful and clean, but there is nothing meaningful inside. Appearances can deceive us and be merely a hollow shell. The instant pleasures of endless sex, drugs, and happiness has no sustenance or meaning underneath. The appearances are perfected, but it's all meaningless since there is nothing underneath. Okay, so what's happening at this point is John is known as John the Savage, okay? He's paraded around by Bernard, and that's how Bernard pretty much, you know, gets all the women in respect, right? Then John finally says, no, I'm going to stop. I don't want to go. So the first time John finally refuses to be paraded around by Bernard, all the people lose respect for Bernard instantly. This represents just how shallow and superficial their liking of him was and how it was all fully fake and how they dislike him so much that they can barely keep up with the pretense of liking him. They leave him and Bernard becomes sad and cries, but then he takes the drug Soma, which before the fame he would never take, right? So there's moments when he said, I would rather be sad than take that Soma, you know? But now it's like he's corrupted and that his hedonistic pleasure seeking expedition has actually made him a slave to his passions and everything always being happy. Before the fame, he would rather be sad than take the Soma. Now he would rather take the Soma than be sad. Okay, Lenina starts to catch feelings for John the Savage, and he likes her too, but instead of going to bed with her immediately as she expects, he denies her and she becomes very confused. Because again, the idea of just going to bed with everybody is just very normal in that society, right? And then so she begins to feel emotions for the first time, and so she's so lost because she's not used to feeling emotions, she takes her drug Soma to feel better. John denies her just to read Shakespeare in his room, which is very interesting. Like, she tries to force herself upon John, and John resists, and then kind of, you know, locks her in the bathroom and stuff, and, like, then he has to leave eventually, but, yeah. Okay, Lenina then starts to grow conscience and has to drug herself to sleep with other men. We can see the infectiousness of John's humanity threatening to undo the false pretense lie that Lenina's existence represents. Unfortunately, with hindsight, right, I feel like we're kind of given red herrings. We're like, oh, Lenina's starting to feel, you know, kind of a conscience, and maybe she'll awaken. She never awakens, guys. At the end, she's still with another dude, and she just never, like, realizes what's going on. So it's actually just sad. There's no like happy ending. There is no even like progression towards the direction of a happy ending. It's just sad from the beginning. Yeah. Okay, so Helmholtz is the guy who Bernard was friends with, right? Who's like the specimen, the really gets all the girls kind of guy, but who also thinks too much. So he writes his own poetry and almost gets fired from his job teaching students, but he feels so alive and awakens his inner purpose. So Helmholtz and John become very close friends. Bernard is a jealous pest. He tries to ruin Helmholtz and John's reading of Shakespeare, which they both deeply enjoy, because he's jealous of them being closer to each other than he is to them. And this is just a kind of random fact of the civilization. So they take all their dead bodies, they cremate them, which means burn them, and then they use a mechanism to recover the phosphorus in the bodies to be put to productive use such that nothing is wasted. This creates a cycle of civilization where nothing is wasted, right? But it doesn't matter because nothing meaningful is produced from civilization anyways, right? Because it's just endless happiness and there's no meaning, right? Okay, so then John eventually confesses his love to Lena, but then rejects her sexual advances, right, and calls her a whore. And this is probably because his experience with his mom and how that's kind of, tearing him apart. Then John has to rush to the hospital to see his mother moments before she dies, but she is in a drug-induced soma haze and in imaginary La La Land with one of her suitors who John hated called Pope. And she keeps saying his name, Pope and Pope, right? And this was one of the people that John actually tried to stab one time when he was like 6 years old because he hated him so much because he kind of, I think, associated him with the reason that he was getting beat up by the kids in the neighborhood and that the reason why they were calling, his mom all sorts of terrible names. And then the worst part is his mom doesn't recognize John. And so John tries to shake her from her trance to like say, hey, it's me, your son. He accidentally kills her because he doesn't really kill her, but it's like that shaking makes her start choking and then she stops breathing. And then before she died, right, he tried to remember all the good times, right? So he's like, oh, let's think about all the good times with her, right? But he eventually struggles and instead brings up many of the bad memories of his childhood and how he was bullied for his mom being, a promiscuous person on the reservation. So John the Savage, has a moment of realization during his grieving of his mother's death and then decides to spread the truth to those who will listen on the street to wake the people up. There are some very large parallels in the story with Christianity, right? Bernard is like Judas betraying Jesus because he refuses to help step in, and then John the Savage is trying to save the mindless robotic people. He is almost like Simon Peter trying to deny Jesus before the rooster crows 3 times because we're talking about Bernard here. Bernard nearly denies his association with John the Savage, even though not long before he was benefiting tremendously in terms of women and fame from his association. The different caste system really emphasized that people should stay in their lane, not try to change anything about their situation or express any kind of agency, and just be happy with where they are. And this book has a really sudden ending. John's friends are exiled to an island because they get caught, right, for like kind of trying to like overturn everything, right? So they're put all the intellectuals there who actually think, right, to separate them from society. And then John the Savage is left to live in London to be experimented on, right, because they think, oh, like he's a spectacle, right? He then decides to escape to a remote island, but is found by tourists on accident, and he goes viral. So they start bothering him again all the time, just when he wants to be left alone, right? That was his idea, live on the island on his own, and he could kind of recreate the reservation and, just suffer in peace. Then he starts to live a tortured existence as he whips himself every time he thinks of Lenina and tries to keep the memory of Linda, his mother, fresh in his mind. In the end, Lenina comes to visit him because she loves him, but in a very different way than how he views love, right? Because she views, oh, everybody can have everybody, and then he's like, no, you can't do that, right? That's not my definition of love. And he ends up chasing her away with a whip and whipping her and whipping himself because he's so distressed and torn, and everybody's watching this. He loves her outwardly because she's beautiful, but he's repulsed by her casual sexual nature because of his bullying and treatment by people on the reservation from others due to his mother's promiscuity, right? However, in the end, the tourists all of a sudden start an orgy, which is really weird, but it's unfortunately normal for that civilization. They just do that. And then he joins them because they're all like taking soma, the drug. So he also takes the soma and then he blacks out, right? So he wakes up on the island and there's nobody there anymore. And then he suddenly remembers what happened the night before and then hangs himself inside the lighthouse where he's kind of staying. This is supposed to represent how even the staunchest rebel can't resist and hold out against this new, efficient, sterilized, and perfected world that is created and ends in a perfect tragedy as the tourists find his body twisting in the air like a compass going all directions, which could point to how his internal compass or morals or the difference between his internal compass and reality was too great, leading him to be lost and to kill himself. Civilization that was perfected had removed all suffering from the world and as a result, all meaning from life. The author tries to use this to argue that suffering is necessary for real humanity. And I think, yeah, that's like the big takeaway of this book, right? Is that like you can't perfect everything, because if you do, you're going to have a lot of problems. Now, of course, I don't think we're ever going to reach this because humans just have too much agency. You can't force us to really do anything that we don't want to do for the most part. But I think this was good in that, like, I like how the fiction took it to the extreme, and used it to prove a point. But I think it was very dissatisfying in that, like, we give this hope of like, oh, Bernard's going to save us. He's going to, overthrow it and they're going to see the light. And then nobody sees the light. And then, oh, John the Savage is going to bring the light to them. And then nobody sees the light and he dies. And then the civilization continues, right? So it's like it's a perfect tragedy where there's no love, right? The love is still fake. That continues on. And their attempts are futile, right? They get rejected. They get isolated on an island. We don't hear about Bernard and Helmholtz ever again after they go to the island. And the rest of the book, which is like probably like 30, 40 pages, they're never mentioned again. And so it's like, it's kind of sad because it's like, wow, the people who stand up to fight, maybe they don't make a difference, And it kind of reveals the danger, of how powerful a society can be to the point where people who dissent can't even make a difference. So yeah, it's a really good one. And I think that it's good, reflecting on my time in high school and how I had to read certain books, right? I never read anything like this, but like, I think it's good maybe to encourage people to pick their own books to read in this situation, because I think when you force someone to read something, it's hard for them to, especially if you have a bunch of assignments, it's hard for them to really enjoy and appreciate it for what it is. And I think that if you allow them to choose books and things like that, they'll have a better appreciation and try to actually think about what this means. Also, I think maybe at a certain age, you have to wait because otherwise you're not mature enough to actually take away anything. So yeah, that was my book review of Brave New World. Liked it a lot. If you have any questions, put them down below. Otherwise, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.